Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lovis and today we are going back to the conversation that we started in January about ecofantasy. In that video I talked about how when I hear the word fantasy I think of secondary world high fantasy and how that's a really blinkered view of a very broad genre. One of the subgenres that I exclude when I do that is anthropomorphic fantasy, and that is exactly what I want to talk about in the next couple weeks. So let's think about what anthropomorphism actually means. It means assigning kind of human-like characteristics to non-human entities, so languages, cultures, behaviors, you get the idea. It's different from personification in that you literally give whatever non-human entity you're talking about these characteristics, rather than personification is kind of more of a figurative tool. You know, the animal actually talks rather than looking into an animal's eyes and feeling like it's trying to talk to you. That's a bit of a vague example, but you catch my drift. And it's not just animals either. Anthropomorphic fantasy can be about any kind of non-human entity. It could be the sea, it can be trees, anything, as long as you are assigning kind of characteristics that we commonly think of as human to something that is not. An article published in Frontier by Gabriella Airenti suggested that our tendency to anthropomorphize is a strategy of attributing to the external environment as much order and meaning as possible, because human thought and action are the highest organization that we know of. So why don't you think back over all the books that you've read that might have featured or may even have been told from the perspective of maybe a talking animal or an animal that possesses some kind of human characteristics, and I bet you'll be surprised at how many there actually are. Yep, you've been reading anthropomorphic fantasy, even if you didn't know that that's what it was called. But now you do, so let's get into it. I kind of started thinking about this type of fantasy when I read a new adaptation of A Wind in the Willows, and I thought, is this ecofiction? It is told from the perspective of animals, but there are no humans in it, so it's not about our relationship with animals, but is that necessary? So I kind of got into a bit of an echo chamber in my head, bouncing back and forth. So as I now do whenever I have any questions about ecofiction, I went to the Rewilding Our Stories Discord server and I chatted to a few people there about whether human presence is needed in ecofiction. Just a nice subtle plug here. And Mary Woodbury in particular reminded me that ecofiction is fiction where nature and or our relationship with our physical environment is very important. So it can just be nature on its own. Humans don't have to have anything to do with it. She quoted Mike Basie's definition of ecofiction, which appears in Jim Dwyer's Where the Wild Books Are, which is stories set in fictional landscapes that capture the essence of natural systems. They can build around human relationships to these ecosystems or leave out humans altogether. The story itself, however, takes the reader into the natural world and brings it alive. So by that definition, Wind in the Willows definitely falls squarely into the category of ecofiction, and so do a number of some of my favorite series and books that I read while I was growing up. The Redwall Stories by Brian Jack, told from the perspective of woodland creatures. The Warriors series by Aaron Hunter, which is all about clans of wildcats in the forests and the plains. Catherine Lasky's Guardians of Ga'Hoole with the owls. Like half the classic Disney films have talking animals in them. Lion King, hello! I devoured these stories. I absolutely loved stories where I was taken into the mind of an animal and shown the world from their perspective. Obviously, it's an imagined perspective, and that doesn't actually mean that's how they truly experience the world, but that little distinction didn't seem to matter to me so much. It was enough to get me to ask the question, what does the world look like to a cat? or a field mouse, or a lion. It was actually quite interesting. On one of the websites that I looked up to do research on anthropomorphic fantasy, there was a little section on who would enjoy it and who wouldn't, and they said you would not enjoy anthropomorphic fantasy if you're an unyielding carnivore, because really, if you can only think about how tasty Bambi would taste, you're really not going to enjoy the story. Also, if you're a wildlife biologist, or similar, who believes that anthropomorphizing animals is detrimental to their existence in the wild, like for example when children wanted little Dories and Nemos in their fish tanks after Disney Pixar's blockbuster hit Finding Nemo, and the demand affected wild fish populations. For other readers, anthropomorphic fantasy is fun and completely enjoyable. I actually thought that was really interesting, especially, of course, the bit about the wildlife biologist, because it made me kind of stop and think, is there like a negative, not so good side to anthropomorphic fantasy and how we use it in ecofiction potentially? And for this, funnily enough, I did go to academic journals for answers, because I found a plethora of research that has been done into this exact question. An article written by Ruth Bernstein et al. In 2013 talks about anthropomorphism as a conservation tool and says that they believe that most conservationists still underestimate the breadth of applicability of anthropomorphism to conservation and are likely to be unaware of research from the social sciences making clear anthropomorphism's potential as a powerful but double-edged sword. The perception of shared features like prosociality, we are a very social species, intelligence, and the ability to grieve could increase feelings of empathy with animals, as these are characteristics that are often seen as human-like. However, this article makes the really interesting point that using these criteria to get people engaged with conservation campaigns could actually implicitly send the message that other animals who do not conform to these characteristics are less worthy of conserving. They are not human-like in the right way. This would exclude all plants and most invertebrates, for example, even though they are crucial in functioning ecosystems. I have to admit, this took a lot of self-control not to fall down this particular rabbit hole for this episode, because my interest is piqued, let me tell you. Anthropomorphism for conservation action, I am doing an episode on that eventually, because I cannot just let this be. I am itching to talk about this, but I do have to move on. But if you are interested, then just, stick around the channel in the next, near future, and there will be an episode on this. But let's bring it back to anthropomorphic fantasy in ecofiction. In general, the genre might seem to be geared towards children, especially in film form like Disney films, although I am absolutely not ashamed to say that I rewatch Disney films on a regular basis. But does using anthropomorphism in these kinds of stories help to send the message that we want? In Ganea et al. 2014's article, Do Cavies Talk? The effect of anthropomorphic picture books on children's knowledge about animals, the abstract reads, the results show that the language used to describe animals in books has an effect on children's tendency to attribute human-like traits to animals, and that anthropomorphic storybooks affect younger children's learning of novel facts about animals. These results indicate that anthropomorphized animals in books may not only lead to less learning, but also influence children's conceptual knowledge of animals. The article found a difference between children depending on whether they were rural or urban raised. Do they spend a lot of time around animals? Do they interact with animals on a regular basis? This will affect how these kinds of stories impact their learning. Urban-raised children's exposure to animals might be limited to the media and the books that they consume, so the more anthropomorphized the animals are in those media, the more human-centric the children learn to make them. Interestingly, they also found that the closer to reality the book is, the better the children learn from it. So actually introducing fantastical elements like talking animals or animals wearing clothes, it might actually reduce the amount of scientific facts that the children are actually taking away from the book? So the answer is, I guess, it depends on a lot of different factors. But if you're talking to kids, it sounds like you need to take some child psychology into account. At first glance, the genre might seem like it's all for kids, but I can think of a few pretty dark examples. I mean, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim were responsible for many a childhood nightmare. Watership Down by Richard Adams, yikes. And I haven't read these, but I've heard that Tail Chaser's Song by Tad Williams and Daniel Polanski's The Builders are super dark, almost grim dark. So we can find examples in this genre that span ages. And does it automatically become ecofiction just because it is told from the perspective of an animal or a tree, or because it features kind of anthropomorphized animals? That all depends, I guess, on your own definition of ecofiction. For a lot of people, yes, that's enough and brilliant. Then you have so many options to choose from. I have linked a couple of Reddit conversation threads in the description below if you are looking for some recommendations. For me, I think I might be leaning slightly towards the story still needing to have some kind of message, like Watership Down talking about farming, or The Rats of Nim being all about animal testing, or Animals of Farthing Wood being all about, drought as well as human development of woodland. So if I think back to Aaron Hunter's Warriors series, even though humans pop up like here and there, the story isn't really about that. So for me personally, I don't think I would put it on my list of ecofiction books. That's just me. This gets us into quite a gray area because it really comes down to your personal definition of ecofiction, which is, I think, completely fine, and I think it's one of the most beautiful things about ecofiction, that it can be so flexible and inclusive, and you can take your pick. Or maybe it all comes down to whether the story makes you think about your relationship with this animal or this plant or this ocean in a new way, not just as an animal, but as a being with emotions and thoughts and a way of life, even if you don't consider those to be as highly developed or complex as ours. So this brings me to a close on this topic for today, but as you can probably tell, I will be revisiting some of the loose threads that I have discovered while making this video. But for today, that's it. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button and the bell so that you get notified every time I post new content about reading or writing ecofiction. If you like what I do and would like to support me, then head on over to patreon.com/ecofictology and become a patron. Your monthly donation buys me my next book, and it also supports Love the Oceans, a marine conservation organization operating out of Mozambique. If you want to talk about ecofiction with other eco-nerds like yourself, then join us on our Rewilding Our Stories Discord server. You'll find all the community you could wish for there. The invite link for that, as well as for the Facebook group, is in the description below if you prefer Facebook to Discord. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists. Also, can I just say how often I mistyped the word anthropomorphic while I was writing the script for this video? I don't think I spelled it correctly on first try once. There are too many O's, too many P's, too many M's. It was a struggle. The things I do for you.